Now, explain a little bit about my background and why maybe I'm even considered an expert in cognitive warfare. I did have a background in political psychology years and years ago. I sort of walked away from it because I thought that it was a little too dark. I didn't want to end up like so many of the other genocide experts, unfortunately people like Iris Chang. I was going to go to business school. I was going to get an MBA until my friends talked me out of it. And then years later, I ended up being in charge of an MBA, and I've worked at business school for the last few years for my sins. This work dates back to my work with the military, specifically the US Air Force. And it wasn't expressly about cognitive warfare. I was in charge of the Minerva Initiative for the US military, for the US Air Force, which now doesn't exist because it was one of the very first things that Pete Hegseth got rid of when he took over the Pentagon. Any reference to our climate work was also gone that first day. The Woodrow Wilson Center's gone, the Office of Net Assessment's gone. I tried explaining to my parents that he's basically ruining, he's destroying my entire career. But cognitive warfare became part of it, and that was because of Ukraine. So when I was with the US Air Force, Ukraine was still sort of like Lisbon 1942. I could go there and I could meet my Russian colleagues, and neither of us needed visas to travel there. So Kyiv was sort of neutral ground at the time. But even at that time, this is around 2011, 2012, I was warning European Command on behalf of my Ukrainian colleagues that there was possibility of actual violence breaking out in the East. And they ignored this because they didn't want to hear it. But I got drawn back, and one of those colleagues was saying, well, we really need to train people about irregular warfare and about, we didn't call it cognitive warfare, but this was one of the big elements of it. And so we put forward a proposal to NATO. They ignored it. And then Maidan happened, and then suddenly Brussels remembered they had something really interesting. So they called us and they said, hey, this is great, but don't do it in Kyiv. We want you to do it in Yalta, which of course is in Crimea. The Russians got there 3 weeks before we did. So for me, this was personal in a lot of ways. And then shortly after, I moved to Kosovo. I spent about 4 years there, and of course Kosovo was itself a hotbed of lots of disinformation. And by the way, if any of you are ever running war games and you need really, really diabolical red cell players, I can put you in touch with some of my Kosovo students, because hands down, they will beat any American, any German, and anyone who sits there going, well, wait, what rule do we follow for, and meanwhile the Kosovars will just run circles around everyone else. But this was something that I got into in large part because I was dealing with energy and environmental security. There's a lot of disinformation that's involved in there. That was the focus of my dissertation. But I was also adopted by the general officer of the Ukrainian army, the head of cyber command, Yuri Danik. And he really wanted me to focus on this. So this is what we've done ever since. And Yuri Danik, it was the article that, I think that's what Alan found. And we're continuing to write. It's not always easy, but let me just ask, how many of you actually work in the cognitive warfare space? Okay. So please do, jump in, raise your hand. But for those of you who aren't familiar, let me just start with this. And by the way, after I came up with the latest model, I was really afraid to show it to my colleagues, but one of them, journalists, looked at this and said, oh yeah, it's the emerald wasp. So the emerald wasp doesn't kill its prey, right? It attacks a cockroach, it temporarily paralyzes the front legs, and then uses that paralysis then to essentially inject a chemical into its brain, which doesn't hurt it. All it does is it removes its octamine kind of motivation to escape. and then very placidly will follow the wasp into its burrow, and the wasp will lay eggs into it, and then it just gets eaten alive. This is kind of a metaphor for some of our politics, I think. Especially, I'm American, living abroad, so I can say that. But this is much of what cognitive warfare is. It's not destruction outright. It's taking advantage of our motivations, our emotions, our will, and it's not simple paralysis either. But it's actually trying to take advantage of maybe even temporary paralysis in order to take greater advantage of us. And what we see is that this is maybe not even something that's new in terms of concept, but with social media, and especially now with generative AI, it's really easy to do. And there are a lot of people out there who are crafty enough and amoral enough to actually take advantage of this. Now, like Ellen said, it's not just the countries that are doing this, right? I mean, I will mention Russia and China because those are two of the biggest players. But of course, Russia's playbook has always been not to do everything themselves. And in fact, they're not the best people to do things themselves. And usually when the GRU does something, they'll screw it up. So they'll use proxies, right? And it also gives them some sort of understandable or plausible deniability. So we have a lot of corporations doing this. We have small-time politicians doing it. And I live in the Philippines, which during the Cambridge Analytica scandal, most of the Facebook identities that were stolen were from the United States. Second biggest number came from the Philippines. The Philippines, because, as Mary Reza said, it's a laboratory, it's a test bed. They'll try things out there. If they don't work, it doesn't matter. If it does work, then they can export it to other English language countries. There's really no enforcement to what goes on there. And everyone has Facebook. It has like a 96% market penetration rate. So it's kind of a crazy country in a lot of ways. And by the way, I say that, I love the Philippines, I love being there. It's definitely safer being there right now than in the United States as a climate and counter disinfo and Ukraine expert. But a lot of people mix up what information warfare and cognitive warfare are. So it's easier to say what it's not, right? Cognitive warfare is not just trying to control information. And most people will go into this thinking that we still think that information is either true or false, that it exists in some sort of binary. And that's one thing we had to abandon. It's more of a Schrodinger's information system. You know, information is potential in someone's head until they're forced to divulge what they believe. And at that point, that actually shapes what they do believe. So how you ask a question, how you shape a post, if it's on social media, how you get someone to interact in a political event, all of that predetermines their beliefs, not just getting them to show what their beliefs are. And I say this as someone with a PhD in political science, so I understand all of the background to it, right? I mean, we're taught over and over again in political science, people have pre-existing beliefs, and surveys simply illustrate what those beliefs are. No, it's not true. People are influenced by the process of even being asked. And there's been plenty of evidence for this in terms of limitations, but it leads us to think then that, well, people are going to make decisions according to the utility of those decisions, right? They'll think ahead about the alternatives, they'll look at the alternative weightings, and no, they don't. They do it large. What do they do it based on?
I'm sorry.
What do they do it based on? What do they make decisions based on, if not?
Well, they're primed. I mean, they've got so many different bases. The idea that Homo economicus is remotely rational is just nonsense.
Right. I mean, it's largely emotional. It's based on identity, and identity is constructed. It can be constructed by others, and people can be hemmed in. So you can predetermine people's decisions in large part by just nudging them in certain directions and saying, oh, you're part of this group, and this group needs to feel this particular way. So our belief that everyone follows this sort of Nash equilibrium, and we're all following some sort of, game theoretical maxim. No, it's not true. And third, the idea that the more information that we have, the better decisions that we make. That's also not true. Yes, thank you for shaking your head in the back. It should be true, right? We're taught this, and we're taught that, yes, go out and find more information. You can make better decisions. But more information will often just paralyze people. It will confuse them. And it will lead them into places that maybe you don't want them to go. Now, I'm not saying that as, please don't interpret that as saying that, oh, we need to censor information, we need to constrain how much information we give to people. I'm just saying it's a background assumption that we have in, say, political science and economics, that the more information that people have, the better decisions that they make. And it just turns out not to be true, especially because when we really modeled this, and not modeled it on the traditional sense, but modeled it in kind of new ways, found out that it's so utterly confused everyone that they just ended up being paralyzed. Or worse, well, I'll get to the worst part. So, one thing that I try to argue is that we don't want to use rational actor models to study something that's largely rational. Because it's the belief in rationality itself that's often the target. In other words, it's the strength of a society. And it's not always just the rational actor model, but I use that just because we're at a university and we're in a business school, so I know that's quite popular. But I can take examples from the Philippines. Philippines have very, very strong cultural traits which they use for survival. And people take advantage of that. There's something called pikikisama, for example. Now, pikikisama means essentially don't rock the boat, don't make a real mess of yourself. Now, people can take advantage of that by saying, oh, well, don't point out when someone's wrong. Don't point out when misinformation is going around. Banihan, Batangnalu, all these things are very strong in terms of Filipino culture, and they're there to try to protect a community from the constant disasters that we face. But they can also be taken advantage of. And there are some very shrewd operators and influencers in the Philippines who are doing this. But likewise, they've done it in the United States. They can take advantage of concepts of meritocracy and then turn it against trans people. They can take concepts of, well, we should have completely fair elections, so therefore we have to have police at all the election stations. Leave that. The point is that you take something that's the strongest in a society or a community, and you turn it against that community. But then that means that community won't be able to just defend itself in its normal ways. And it won't even know necessarily that it's being attacked until afterwards. Now, I do say here that the objective is paralysis. That's one of the possible objectives. We will get to the other one. And rather than the data pipeline, because information warfare was always about controlling the data flow, right? What do people see on TV? What do people see in the newspaper? What do people get in terms of a political campaign? But now we're being conditioned in terms of what we think, how we think. And that's more subtle. It's more subtle because it's harder to track, right? It's much easier to track the flow of information and what we're being exposed to. But how we think, that's a lot more difficult. And that's by design, partly. because the people who do this sort of influencing know exactly what they're doing. And it's also easier to cover their tracks that way. But it's not for deception and censorship. That's the old model. Now, when I say entropy and dimensional expansion, now this goes into the mathematics of the model. Now, I won't go into that, and I think Alan shared with you, there's a concept version of the paper that I've made public. The more mathematical version is currently under review with an astrophysics journal in Ukraine. By the way, I should point out, I saw this all one night. It took me a full month to try and figure out what it was that I saw in terms of the model, because I normally don't go for formal models. And then finally shared it with Yuri, and it was scary. Not only because Yuri is a journal officer, that part doesn't scare me. What scared me is that now that he's retired, he's the rector of the mathematics faculty at the National University. And he wrote back and he said, well, yeah, there are a couple things that I'm going to change. And then I didn't hear back from him until he said, yes, and I've just submitted it to Space and Science Technology. Okay, I guess. But, you know, it's general officers, they get to kind of do what they want, especially in war zones. I will try to explain a little bit of that if anyone has any questions. But the models, unfortunately, work. And part of the reason the models work is because we abandoned the traditional binary ideas of the Nash Equilibrium or in terms of economics. So we actually use von Neumann entropy, which, for those of you who know your quantum physics, is slightly more complicated. And I kept thinking, no, this will never work, this will never work. And it actually worked. And it worked because beliefs are a potentiality in our brain, right? And they don't exist, it's, like I said with Schrodinger's cat, they don't exist until we express them. And there are ways to manipulate that so that it comes out in particular ways. And I will get to the defense doctrine because I think that's important. I don't like just scaring people, but I do also want to get to the point of how do we actually do something. Now, there are two major components to cognitive warfare, at least as it's usually practiced. There are different ways. Now, white noise, you all know. It's a common term. You all know the fire hose model in terms of Kremlin propaganda. And the Kremlin isn't the only one who does it. One could say that the current White House is also very good at it without even trying. They'll do 16 things in a day and you can't try even 12 of them. White noise, however, is, let me say, it's a little bit different these days than the older model. The older model was personnel intensive, meaning if you had people in the GRU or the SBR who were writing this, and that actually took some effort. Now it takes almost zero marginal effort when you have generative AI to do it. The spreading of it is extraordinarily easy through social media. And what we get isn't just a flooding. So according to the model, it's basically a dimensional expansion. You get a logarithmic growth in the number of potential hypotheses. And I don't want to get technical here, but under traditional information theory, if we use, for example, like Dempster-Schaeffer theory, there are only a set number of hypotheses that are available. Here I'd say it's effectively unlimited. It just keeps growing. But white noise by itself won't do it. So the other thing that I was really struggling to get across to people, and especially my students, because I run them through a war game in the first term of their master's program. And there's some cells that I flood with information, there's some that I starve with information. I didn't really have a good way of explaining all this. So I came up with the concept of black noise, which is where you're attenuating the signal. And this can take any number of different forms, whether you're firing scientists, whether you're silencing critics, whether you're erasing data from the Pentagon servers. It's a way of getting rid of reliable signals. Right, so what's happened to CBS News? That was a formerly reliable signal that no one's going to listen to now. And when we lose that, we found is that it's more damaging than we thought. Because it's one thing to lose your sense of what's happening, but, and I say this as a pilot from ages ago, it's one thing to lose your instruments. If you lose your orientation, that's the scary part. And that's essentially what happens here. Losing the black noise means that we lose our orientation. They're also not as obvious in terms of attacks. People may say, oh, we lost such and such, or we can't access this anymore. That's incredibly destructive, especially if a community relies upon it for knowing what's happening. Now put together, you have three things happening. So there's the dimensional expansion. That means that people they're looking for a needle in the haystack when it comes to what the truth is. They simply can't find it. And at the same time, they're losing all the reliable signals they would usually use in order to figure out their orientation, or to figure out, well, what's really happening in the community. And what that results in then is a sort of coherence collapse, a denial of reality attack. And when John Boyd came up with the OODA loop, the OODA loop is observe, orient, decide, act. And he was writing this as a fighter pilot, but we taught it in emergency management as well. We found is that it wasn't just that we were losing our usual signal. Boyd actually predicted, in a lot of ways, that orientation would be the key part. Like, he knew that if you could disorient another pilot in a dogfight, then you were going to win. Now, he didn't understand how that would happen politically, but I think that's what we're seeing now, is that we're losing the orientation. We may even have the information in front of us, but if we can't figure out what to make of it, if we can't figure out, okay, well, how do we put this in perspective? How do we explain this to other people? Then you're disoriented. And that later means then that you're constantly reorienting, and you never get around to acting. I think the US Congress is perhaps in this point right now. Right? I mean, are they actually acted on anything serious? No. I mean, we see President Trump threatening to, obliterate Iran by later today. He's also been moving money around that he's not authorized, right, in Congress. Just, okay. We'll just wait and see. That's a form of paralysis. So it essentially means a catastrophic OODA loop failure. That when people are disoriented, they will constantly just try to reorient themselves, and they will never get around to the decision or to the action. And you've probably seen people like this. To say, well, let's just wait for more information. Let's just wait, I can't quite figure out what's going on. So we'll figure it out as we go along. So when you never reach the decide or the act phases, then the adversary wins. They can take action. I mean, that's the whole point of the OODA loop in the first place, is that if you could act inside someone else's OODA loop, then you would win. This means it'll just freeze completely and people can do whatever they want. So the first new model that we've come up with, and this is the real simplified version of it, is that we have to look at the effective capacity to act. It's not enough just to look at it in terms of paralysis, but there's a threshold, there's a phase shift, beyond which effective action just doesn't happen anymore. Like I said, we've seen that with US Congress, we've seen it with a number of agencies. And once you're in that, what I would call institutional necrosis, and I use the biological metaphors because I tried using the physical metaphors, but that wasn't really justified enough. But you know that when something becomes necrotic, it doesn't just go away quietly, right? Biological material becomes inflamed. It fights entropy. And it can poison the rest of the system. And that's much of what we're often seeing, is that institutions that become necrotic, they lose the will to effectively act. And then they become in a state-dependent loop. That means that what they need in order to get out of it is institutional trust. But that's what's been lost. So it's very difficult for them to break out of that once they're there. And we've modeled this in a number of different ways, and there's no good way out, other than just getting rid of the organization and starting over again, which is what has happened in the past with certain organizations. They simply become defunct. But the paralysis part, that's one of the targets. Now, I did suggest that there was another one. So I was trying to model this, and I just could not figure out how to put it in terms of the correct units. So the other outcome, however, is where someone else provides some sort of pattern. This is what I call the zombie fix. And where an institution or an individual fixes upon that pattern, and they see that as what really explains what's going on. They can find the will to act again, but it can be counter to their own survival. And you've probably seen people like this. I admittedly, it's off the record, seen people in my own family like this. And it helps to explain why someone, once they adopt one conspiracy theory, are much more open to adopt others. Because people, when they're faced with complete paralysis, complete uncertainty, there's a certain sort of pain that comes with that. You know, cognitive pain and apophenia. The idea that you'll start seeing connections where they don't necessarily exist. And if someone conveniently comes in and says, "Oh, I had the perfect explanation. It's because, it's because trans people are taking their jobs. It's because whatever conspiracy you want to throw in, it's a simple explanation." By the way, I came up with this talking with my colleagues because a certain, I won't go into it, but a certain former colleague and friend is now a regular on Steve Bannon's podcast. And I was trying to explain what happened. We were so close. And yet, but the explanation is that she believed that there was an establishment, right, that was holding back effective action against China. Because it was against China that she's always been active, and still does. But then believed that, oh, well, these are the only people who are going to listen to me. But once in that community, it just becomes difficult to break out again, because everything's so simple, and everything makes sense again. But institutions can suffer from this as well. They can start acting against their own interests. They can start adopting standard operating procedures that don't really make sense in terms of the organization. Like I said, I work at a business school. We've seen businesses that have done this. We've seen governments that have done this. Yes?
Can I ask questions now?
Oh, yes, please, ask questions.
I have questions for my questions. So, for example, for me, the model makes sense if somebody is there actively calculating and orchestrating all of this. How much, and a lot of what I see to me seems like complete incompetence. So, how much of it do you have to have a deliberate actor planning all of this? Versus, we'll wait and see how far people go.
I would guess that for every, and there's an article that just came out this morning that was talking about how much disinformation is passed not as discrete packets of information, but as complete narratives. Right? So people become emotionally attached to it. Yeah. And I would say that, this is a guess, but they're going to be 90 narratives that fall flat, and then one will pick up and carry, right? And there are people who are, I think, intuitive enough to know which ones are going to work better than others. But I would say these are more biological than mechanical, right? So I put up the diagram with the gears, but I think the spread is more biological in the sense of sometimes the infection will just sort of peter out. Sometimes it just becomes feverish. It's kind of hard to predict in advance, and that's always the danger with biological weapons, is that you never know which one's really going to work and which one isn't. And as I'll mention, they also come back to attack the person who set them free in the first place.
And to your point, there was another family member who was an anti-vaxxer, and now they've just completely gone down the rabbit hole just from that set of events.
Yeah, there's usually one thing that's an opening, and then after that, and I'm sorry, that's
Critical thinking is not a thing.
it's not. I mean, how many of us teach critical thinking anymore? I mean, I try, but in between everything else that we're doing, and my students are 45 by the time they reach me, so I'd like to think that they're critically thinking by the time they apply.
I'll explain what I'm asking. I'm a policy advisor for doing a governmental disinformation countermeasure policy and social resilience. So we're working on critical thinking as well. And listening about Ukraine's in peculiar because you talk about institutional trust. Yet the data shows that Ukrainians are socially resilient only because they totally distrust institutions. So in a situation where there is no one to count on, I do myself what needs to be done from my perspective. You have about chaos, but usually it's a lady reopening kindergarten or someone bringing the food to the elderly. So it's not per se completely. Also, again, the happiness exposure to the annual time all this time. But I think certain stress situations put you down, back on your feet. It depends on your personality.
Well, I think Ukrainians are dealing with the reality of the conflict so much that they have to trust each other to a certain extent. The institutions, I agree, because they were inherited from, yeah. So that's a good point. But you're also pointing out that when people have no, we once wargamed what would happen to disinformation efforts in combination with the disaster. This was in Alaska, and all the internet went out, and so all the disinformation efforts failed because no one was bothering to be on their phone anymore. Yes.
Yeah, so I have a couple of thoughts. So one thing that's just, and maybe I'll get to this more, but as an American, like the institutions collapsing, especially the academic institutions collapsing and law firms collapsing and all of that is part of what makes this moment so scary. And I think this is sort of a brilliant metaphor for that. So, but I also, just another comparison, I'm curious what you think of this, so what that's potentially really scary is thinking about what happened in Afghanistan when the Taliban took over and the army just collapsed and the president fled to Turkmenistan. And then I think about it, it's who trained the Afghan army? We did. Where did Ashraf Ghani rise to? As I understand it, he was at Johns Hopkins as a professor, also in the American system. And is there something about how American systems have developed in recent decades that made us really vulnerable to this? And I don't know if the Afghanistan comparison is actually apt, but it feels similar how the institutions just collapsed in the face of threat. But I'm curious what you think of that.
Well, I think that's more the American imperial reach. It just had its fingers everywhere. And there is something about American education which is very trusting in certain ways when it comes to technology.
Or protective mechanisms about getting into that bigger loop. Anything specific?
Yeah, and I can get to it in a minute. The best thing we found is a good offense. So don't just sit back and do fact verification, because it won't work and you can't accept the adversary's frame of reference. So the best way of doing it that we found anyway, like first of all, don't do the effects-based operations. Don't wait for bad things to happen, try to trace it back to an original message and then counter it, because that just doesn't work. I mean, I assume most of you know that that argument doesn't work, but just making it clear. So we're looking at more of a morphological shift. In other words, to look at the morphology of the attack itself, and not just the message, right? But this is, again, what I learned from Ukraine is that when things happen, they don't happen individually, right? They'll often happen in coordination with one another. So you'll have a physical attack at the same time that there's an informational attack. Well, the informational attack will come first. In fact, there was an interesting report about that called information alibis, where the Russians were more or less admitting what they were going to do ahead of time, but doing it in a way that made it look like it was the Ukrainians' fault. So, and this is the second model, which looks really simple, and it is, but my co-author, Briggs she and I worked on this for a number of years. And essentially it means you break down the message into the equivalent of a grammatical formulation, right? So you know who the subject's going to be. That's what it is that you're talking about in the first place. The object, that's going to be the target. Who's the target of that particular attack? Verb, that's the action. And the thing, I think this is one of the reasons that there's a change, is because the actions are much more difficult to hide these days. Right? I mean, thanks to Bellingcat and everyone else who works in that space, if the tanks are moving, they can't deny that. But what they can do is the adverbial attack. They can twist the meaning of what you're seeing. Right? And this is what they did in Crimea. Oh, the troops are there, but they're in a friendly fashion. They're on vacation. There were tourists who got lost. And it was out of the frame of reference that Western countries were sitting there going, wait a second, how do we respond to this? Just enough time that the Russians could put forward their fake referendum.
Pay no attention to the man behind the curtain.
No.
Sorry, I should have put my hand up. I'm doing a similar discourse analysis. I use different language, but I'm applying it into financial markets. And I'm really worried that what you're seeing here on the battlefield is being injected into the financial services industry as we speak. And I'm really quite freaked out by this.
Okay.
Information systems are being destabilized as we speak. Actors are being removed. Information is you were worried about, by the way, my company's called Minerva Analytics. You're worried about your climate change disappearing. Investors are terrified about climate change data disappearing. They have not got the people anymore to depend upon to make trillion-dollar decisions. And something else is being substituted, which is governments trying to take control within pension funds to redirect into government-sponsored pet projects like cyber.
Okay, well, we'll talk.
We will.
Yes.
I apologize, I wasn't here for the whole thing, I just put in, and my arms are pretty tired. This model seems to fit very well what's being discussed right now in terms of the rescue of the airmen and sort of the deflection and this information that some say is going on about the real cause of the multiple. Am I understanding the model correctly?
Yes. I mean, you could apply it to a number of different discourses or explanations, and whenever something is sort of fishy, like why would they blow up $300 million worth of aircraft to save one guy, and then they don't even show him on TV afterwards.
They're not anywhere near that.
No, it is, because if they're trying to deflect you away from what's really happening, then it's often easiest to just change the meaning of what people are seeing on TV.
Is it more likely that you're getting disinformation if there's more information coming out about something than less?
No, it could be either. I mean, either someone could be starving you information. It really has to do with the audience expectations, right? And so the report that we just had from the Minderu Center, and they said that, well, social media companies don't give out any information, so they're still going to give out very little information. They could be lying with the little information they give out. Whereas in other places, it makes more sense for them to simply flood people with information, especially if it's easy to create. And certain information is really easy to create these days. So I can't give a straight answer about that. It sort of depends upon, I mean, it's the same thing I did in my war games with my students. Some cells I would flood with information to see how they reacted, others I would starve them. And then they would react in different ways. Now, I mentioned the information alibi. There was a pretty good report about this, but Leonidka was an example of this, where essentially the Russians said ahead of time that they were going to attack a place. But ahead of time, they were trying to blame the Ukrainians for it. And that was the adverbial part of it. So the verb was not in question. It was who was doing it, why it was being done. But it also meant that if you could decipher this very well in advance, you could actually see that, well, this is targeting. It's announcing what the target is ahead of time. But it's doing it in a way that tries to absolve the Russians of responsibility for the attack. All right, now I've mentioned the verification trap. I'm not saying that verification is bad per se, because I'm a professor, so I have to say that. But spending all of our time doing it just doesn't work. So in terms of the question about what we do instead, we found is the concept of narrative interruption. Now, if you remember the 2024 US presidential election, if you remember what was the thing that really got the Trump-Vance campaign tied up? That they were trying to deny but couldn't really deny?
Immigration. Borders?
Remember all the couch fucking jokes? But that was an example. It was an example, and when we went historically, this was one of the best ways, because authoritarian systems and personalities are very fragile. They can only accept one version of the truth. Now you have to approach them differently. So whether it's the Kremlin or whether it's Beijing or whether it's a particular personality, they're going to react differently to it. But if you attack the adversary's framing, in other words, don't just sit back, but go after, if you can figure out who's conducting the attack, which isn't always possible. Because if they end up trying to explain what they're doing, it's sort of like stand-up comedy. If you're spending your time explaining, you're losing your audience. So we found that this was one of the best ways of doing it. And there were examples from history. Battle of the Bulge in 1944. The 101st Airborne was surrounded by Germans. The Germans sent them a very detailed surrender plan. Do you remember your military history, Alan?
Vaguely.
The commanding general sent back a one-word reply to the Germans saying, nuts. The Germans were so confused, like they couldn't figure out what this meant, what context it was in. And of course, it was a morale boost for all the soldiers who knew that their general was just like, hell with you guys, we're not going to. They rejected the framing, right? They didn't try to negotiate with the Germans. They didn't try to say, oh, well, let's do this instead of this. They simply refused. Another example from the Second World War was 1942, the Doolittle raid on Tokyo. The Japanese had this sense of invulnerability. And that raid, and this was a message, it was a physical message, but it broke that sense of invulnerability. It actually meant that the Japanese kept a number of key carriers back from the Battle of Midway, which could have very easily tipped the balance of things in the Pacific. And one of the most famous was from 2022 in Ukraine, Snake Island. Remember, there were a number of border guards on the island. There was a large Russian warship that said surrender. And they said, "Dear Russian warship, fuck off." Became a stamp. But it was that sort of break of narrative that was important, right? It wasn't accepting the frame. It wasn't saying, "Oh, well, yeah, we need to just fight this physically." Now, I know that there are ethics involved in that, but still, it's something that matches with what we found historically. And most people are afraid to do it. You do need to decide who the messenger is as well. So in the Philippines, for example, it's currently one of the chief spokespeople of the Coast Guard, who's a vice admiral, and who's been attacking Xi. And I did have to advise them and say, okay, he's not the guy to do the attacks, and you don't attack Xi directly, right? You usually go after the deputies, don't go after the head guy. There are various ways we'll work this out. That's actually part of US cyber doctrine, is you don't go after the head honcho, go after deputies as much as possible. But let me just end with an example of where it actually worked. So when I lived in Kosovo and I was running disinformation war games, I had my students use live Twitter accounts. And I told them to write in their biographies, this is for such and such simulation, do not take this seriously. One student forgot to do that, forgot to close his account afterwards. A year goes by and he was in the red cell. So he had a biography that wrote that he was a PhD student at Moscow State University, was a foreign affairs advisor for the Russian government. His dad in real life owned a TV network in the Balkans. So a year later, this Albanian professor writes a hit piece, not on the father, but on the son, saying, look at this turncoat, look at this person who lives in Kosovo but works for Russia. I found out about this about 12 hours after it went live on Facebook. So this happened on like a Saturday morning. I found out about it on Sunday morning by walking into the bike cafe. So all my cyclist friends who knew nothing about politics, and they all looked at me and said, "Chad, we heard about your student." I was like, what? It wasn't just the student, all his classmates. They responded en masse. They rejected the framing. They made merciless fun of the professor in Albania, pointing out that he didn't do his homework, that this was for a fictional country called Donchuana. And they would even start putting up like fictional UEFA schedules where Donchuana and Atlantis would go off against one another. I mean, it was just relentless for like 12 hours. And then this Albanian professor crawled into a rock someplace and wasn't seen again until there was a court case later. Yeah. But they did the right thing, right? They acted in a coordinated fashion. They didn't take offense at what happened. They just mocked mercilessly. They didn't accept the frame, but pointed out how the basic frame was completely flawed in the first place. And they didn't call me. They did eventually call me just to confirm, yes, this was a simulation. But they handled it themselves. I was actually quite proud of them. We can do much of this, but it requires a different sort of education, requires a different sort of understanding how information works. And like I said, it does require some people to go on the offensive, which we're not comfortable with doing. We want to be too polite, we want to just fact check and just do our job. But ultimately we found that that doesn't work on its own.